I really tried. I really tried, you guys. I swear to God, I did not read this in bad faith. I was genuinely hoping that I was going to like this book more. And to be fair, I did like it better than the first one, but for the amount of love that this duology gets, it did not hit for me. So let's get into it. So if you remember, we left off in One Dark Window with the Nightmare slash the Shepherd King taking control of Elspeth's body and being locked up by King Rowan in the dungeon. And they had come up with this deal that if King Rowan doesn't kill Emery and instead uses the Nightmare's blood to end and lift the mist and to end the curse, then the Nightmare would show the king where the Twin Alders card was located so that they could actually lift the mist and end the infection. So right off the bat, I noticed that in book 2, we were going to be doing a lot of POV switching back and forth between characters, whereas book 1 was simply first person point of view from Elspeth's point of view. So in the beginning, I didn't mind it so much because if you remember, I genuinely did not like Elspeth's character in the first book. So I was more than happy to see that she was not going to be taking up a lot of space in the second book. Sue me. But the interesting thing about that is that in Two Twisted Crowns, Elspeth's POVs are still in first person, whereas Elm and Raven's POVs are in limited third. So I thought that was a really interesting choice. And by interesting, I mean, I didn't like it. I would have much preferred that Gillig either did first person POV from all three characters or that she had gone for a third omniscient narration in this book where we get to be inside of the minds of all of the characters that we come across. Ione and those two sisters, Otho and Hellas, something like that. Doesn't matter because anyway, I'll get into it because I have so many thoughts on this fucking book. Now, something that I do think was well done is the fact that in the first few chapters, Gillig manages to articulate a lot of the points and events that were made in the first book in an effective manner. She wasn't just info dumping, she was actually inserting these points and questions that the readers had from the first book. So what happened to Elspeth's family, and obviously we learned that her aunt Opal and her young cousins, as well as her stepmom and her two sisters, managed to escape and get to safety before the Destriers were able to arrest them, whatever. And so I thought that was well done. I thought that Gillig was tying up a few loose ends and giving the reader a refresher from the first book in a very smooth and organic way. So I'll give it a little bit of credit there. I'm not here to just shit on this book, all right? I'll tell you the things I liked too. They are few and far between, but they are there, I promise. Now, early on in the book, we do come across Elm's point of view where he has returned to Hawthorne House. And somehow, some way, Ione is there, right? She doesn't know shit about where her mother and her siblings are. She has no idea what happened with Elspeth, with her dad, with her uncle Eric, all being arrested. She doesn't know anything. And she's very confused as to where everyone is. And of course, that had me wondering, where the hell has Ione been that she didn't know that all of this was going on? We do learn that later on in the book. It was a really messed up situation, but we do learn that Hoth, it was like the night of or the night before Elspeth slash the Nightmare attacked Hoth and ripped him to shreds. He had actually pushed Ione out of a fucking window to her death. But because she had the maiden card on, she didn't die. She was just left to die. It was really horrible. It was terrible to hear about that. And that kind of answers the question of where she was. But we don't know this at this point in time. Early on in the book, we have no idea that's what happened. We're just meant to question it a little bit. So I'm going to skip ahead a bit because, like I said, I have a lot of thoughts about this. My script is like 7,000 words. I'm going to try to condense it down because it's just too much. But basically, I did really, I will say for all of the flaws that the second book had, I did thoroughly enjoy it a lot more than I did the first one. and being excited about it, I was really optimistic. So right off the bat, Elm, Ione, they're having this, you can tell that they have this romance going on. There is a lot more chemistry between them. There is a lot more buildup of their romance than I felt like there was in Raven and Elspeth's situation in the first book. So I was thoroughly enjoying that a lot more. I think that Elm and Ione had so much more chemistry and that they were much more engaging and interesting characters than Raven and Elspeth ever were for me. So I was excited about that, especially when I realized that we were going to be going back and forth between all these POVs, and that in Elm's section, most of it was his and Ione's relationship building. So I thought that was well done. Up until a certain point, I do have some beef with a little bit of it, and I'll get to that later on. So by the time we get to chapter 10, I did realize that Elm and Ione, their romance was going to be a bulk of the book. And there was so much tension, so much hostility, so much witty banter between them that it was a more substantial relationship than Raven and Elspeth's. There was a moment though that I was like, but I'll get into that. So the writing was much stronger for this book. I will say that Gillig managed to keep a lot of that strong writing that was at the end of One Dark Window. She was able to transition that into the second book. And I thought that for the most part, that was well done. With that being said, there was still a bit of a repetition issue in the second book. I was able to overlook it a lot easier in Two Twisted Crowns than I was in One Dark Window, because One Dark Window, I did not enjoy it at all. The repetitiveness was like, it was relentless. It was distracting from the actual story. Whereas in this book, I kind of just let it go. But with that being said, I do think that Gillig's writing could be much stronger if she was able to just get rid of that repetition issue. She uses the word indefatigable 2 times within 5 pages. You know, indefatigable is not a common enough word that you're able to that is not a commonly used word, at least not in my vocabulary. So to use it 2 times in such a short period of time, it was very noticeable. And I did kind of like roll my eyes, especially because she's using it in the same way for the same character. She was talking about Eric Spindle when they were having their whole inquest situation where the king was questioning him and Tiern Hawthorne and Ione. So to use the word indefatigable 2 times about Eric Spindle within a couple pages, again, may I introduce you to the invention of the thesaurus? It is such a good tool for a writer to use. I don't know how even the editors didn't catch that. Why would you not have her? Anyway, fuck it. Moving on. Like I said, I don't want to get hung up on the repetition, because while I was reading it, I decided to do myself a favor and just glide past it. I was like, fuck it, Frank, just move on, because I'm not getting hung up on this. So between Raven and Elm's chapters, we do get mini chapters from Elspeth's POV where at first she doesn't know where she is. She is wading in these deep, dark waters similar to an ocean, but every time we switch back to her POV, she is regaining her memory a little bit at a time until eventually she does remember who she is. She does remember what happened with Hoth and with the nightmare taking control of her body and all this stuff. So she gets to a point where she is screaming at the nightmare to let her out, let her out. And that is most of her character's experience in the first third of the book. She has pretty much no substantial moments. There is nothing that we're learning. There is no information about her character that is interesting or frankly even worth. I feel like Gillig just inserted these 4-5 page chapters just to remind us that Elspeth existed, because most of the time her point of view is basically just backstory for the nightmare, especially the further on we get into the book. It's just her living his memories. So Elspeth's chapters are actually the Nightmare's chapters, or the Shepherd King's chapters, where we're learning his backstory, how he came to create the Providence cards, how his children died, how he died. That's what Elspeth's character was about. And I will get into that critique in a little bit. But I didn't mind it for the most part because, again, I don't like her. I do not like her character. I found her very flat, very uninteresting, very boring. And again, I'll get into that critique, but I wasn't mad at it. I found the Nightmare to be a much more interesting and dynamic character. So I wasn't upset to see that her point of view was mostly the Nightmare's point of view. So again, early on, Elm and Ione go down to the dungeon where the Nightmare is being kept up until they're ready to leave to go find the Twin Alders. And that is because they know that the Nightmare can see the colors of the Providence cards. And somehow, some way, Ione has lost hers. We don't know how. We don't know why. We do learn that it was actually Hoth that got her really, really drunk and forced her to hide her own maiden card so that she could not release herself from the magic. And Hoth is such a dick, dude. Anyway, we know this. But at this point in time, Hoth, he is not conscious. His body is broken and bloodied and just messed up. And it is not looking good for Hoth, which I was happy to see. He's a dick. But Ione and Elm do need to find her maiden card so that she can be released from the magic, because she says, she's like, I at least want the choice. She's like, whether or not I decide to use this card when I want to, I want the choice to be able to do it, which is totally valid, girl. I hear you. So they go down and the Nightmare tells them, he's like, look, I can see 3 maiden cards within the castle or on the property of the castle, right? I can't tell you which one is yours. I can only tell you that there's 3. You're going to have to find it yourself. And so they leave. Now, here's something that I did have a problem with. When Elm and Ione are moving down to the dungeon to go find the Nightmare to have this conversation, there is a moment, because again, this is after her inquest. This is after the king has questioned her and her father and Elspeth's father. So in that moment, Eric had attacked Tyrn, and Elm decided to pull out his scythe card and freeze everybody in the room. He froze the king, he froze all the destriers, he froze everybody. He used his scythe to get everyone to just stop. Okay? That's fine. Later on, Elm and Ione are going down to talk to the Nightmare, and as they are descending down into the dungeon, Elm kind of zones out for a second. He is having thoughts. He's having a moment where he's just zoning out. And Ione says, she's trying to get his attention, and she's like, hey, what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, I'm just cold. And she says this really corny thing where she's like, oh, I might have thought that you didn't mind the cold. What with you freezing us all in the throne room or whatever. Again, referencing him using the scythe card to make everybody stand still. What a fucking corny thing to say. What an absolutely atrocious piece of dialogue that was. It ripped me right out of this. I was like, what the fuck? And again, it's because Gillig lacks the talent and the ability most of the time to insert useful information for the reader and doing it organically and in a very natural series of events. She has a hard time doing that. So she needed us to see that Ione understood that Elm was not like his dad and his brother, because Elm proceeds to tell her, he's like, oh yeah, well, I don't use the scythe card for violence. And that was the whole point of that interaction, was for Elm to show Ione, no, I'm not like my brother. I'm not like my dad. I don't use the scythe to hurt people. I use it for good, right? And it was done in such an inorganic, ridiculous way. That piece of dialogue was just, it was dumb. It was really bad. You couldn't think of any other way to show Ione that Elm isn't like his dad and his brother in the way that they use their scythe for violence. You couldn't find a more organic and natural way to insert that piece of information. You couldn't have had her figure it out for herself, see the way that he goes about doing it. You had to just, anyway, it was annoying. It ripped me out of the story because, again, we're in the first third of this book still. So that was one of the moments where I was like, oh no. Oh no, this is not looking good. It was just not looking good, yo. So after this moment where Ione and Elm have left the dungeon after having their conversation with the nightmare, we switch to the next chapter, which is actually Raven's POV. And turns out he was using his mirror card to spy on them during this he was already down in the dungeon. He used his mirror card to turn invisible, and he witnessed Ione and Elm have this entire conversation with the nightmare. And not sure what the point of that was to have him witness that, but I'm sure there was a reason. Maybe I just didn't get it. But it is worth noting that up until this point in the book, there does seem to be a bit of tension between Elm and Raven. There is something brewing between them where ever since Elspeth, her body was taken over by the Shepherd King, and now she's in the dungeon, things have not been going well between Elm and Raven, and there is something brewing there. Which it did have me curious because I was like, oh, does that mean, is one of them going to betray the other? Is this going to turn into a Brutus Rowan slash Taxus situation, aka Elm's ancestor and Raven's ancestor? I thought that could have been an interesting turn of events, but no, turns out none of it, nothing. There was whatever tension they had, whatever beef they had going on, it was irrelevant to the story. Other than the fact that they do separate and that Raven goes to find the Twin Alders, whereas Elm is forced to stay back at Castle Stone. And that was at King Rowan's request, or demand, I should say. So the king was the one that told Raven, he's like, yeah, you're not going to take Elm. He's going to stay here with me because he is now the heir to the throne because of Hoth's situation. And Raven is not really in a position to tell the king that that's not going to fly. So that's how they get separated. And so part one ends with Raven's group being Raven, the Nightmare, and Gorse, who was a destrier that the king sent to kind of spy on Raven and make sure that he was going to go do what he said he was going to do. It ends with them leaving the castle on horseback and King Rowan and Elm kind of watching them gallop away. And of course, Elm had no idea that Raven was going to be leaving. Raven just left him a note that was like, I'll see you soon. But Elm had no idea that Raven was going to go get the Twin Alders without him until he saw him and the Nightmare galloping away on horseback. And that's where part one ends. And naturally, part two opens up to Elm's POV, where he is actually watching Raven and the Nightmare gallop away on horseback. And clearly, Elm is upset. He's annoyed at this. He's kind of pissed off. He's wondering why Raven didn't take him. And he's standing next to the king, and King Rowan is basically like, yeah, you're going to be the heir now, so you got to get your shit together. You can't go gallivanting off with your cousin anymore. You have responsibilities. And for the entirety of this book, King Rowan is drunk. He is not having an easy time dealing with the fact that his firstborn son is in the state that he is in. And he is just not coping well. He's pissed off. He's angry. He's annoyed with Elm and pretty much everybody else. But he has a moment of redemption, I guess you could say later. I'm not going to go as far as to say he redeems himself. He's still a douchebag, but he does have a moment where you're like, okay, it is what it is, right? So like I said, every time we get to Elspeth's chapters, we are basically just learning more about the Nightmare and the origins of the Shepherd King and how he came to create the Providence cards. And her chapters are very short. They're very to the point. And again, they have almost nothing to do with Elspeth as a person, as a character herself. It is all just the Nightmare's experience and history and memories that she's just experiencing. Because the thing is it's not even like Gillig wrote it in a way that made it seem like Elspeth was actually the one experiencing the memory. She's still telling it from first person point of view as if she's the one living it, but it's all the Shepherd King's memories. So of course, flipping back and forth, we're going between Raven's group leaving Castle U, and it's Jesper, it's Peter and Wick Ivy, it's Gorse and Raven and the Nightmare. So that's the group that goes to go find the Twin Alders card. And then from Elm's point of view, it's him and Ione basically devising a plan to find her maiden card and release her from the magic, because Elm said that he made a promise to her, a life for a life. She saved his life from those highwaymen, and so therefore she asked him in return to save her life. And that's kind of why they have that plan going. And of course, as the book goes on, they fall more and more in love with each other. It's romantic, it's cute. I was vibing with it. I did feel like they had a lot of good chemistry, despite the fact that Ione didn't really have a personality. She was very cold hearted, very statuesque in the way that she could not really show emotion, other than, of course, desire. Desire was the only thing that she could still show. And I have beef with that, but I will get into it a little bit later on. So in part two, we do learn how Hoth got Ione drunk on the night where they announced their engagement at Equinox. And we learn a lot of the terrible shit that he did to her. He was not nice. He was pretty abusive, actually, to her in a very short amount of time. It was not a good relationship by any means. And they're trying to figure out where her maiden card is by using the chalice card to get her to tell the truth so that maybe it would jog her memory, because you can't lie when you drink from the chalice. So, of course, they're having a very romantic and intimate moment. They're sharing a lot of secrets with each other that they really haven't told other people. And this is creating a lot of intrigue with their relationship. And I didn't mind this. Like I said, I felt like their dynamic was much stronger than Raven and Elspeth's ever was. Everything that I wanted from Raven and Elspeth's relationship, I was getting from Ione and Elms, and I felt like it was a very genuine connection. And it made a lot of sense because they were bonding over being abused by the same person in a very similar way. So it made a lot of sense that they would have the connection that they did. And while they are using the chalice card, they obviously have a moment where they start kissing. And I'm not gonna lie, I was kicking my little feetsies a little bit. I was with it. And then, of course, Philip walks in and kind of ruins the moment. Not his fault. He didn't know. He did knock. But yeah. So Ione runs out of the room and doesn't talk to Elm for like 2 days or something like that. So after this moment, we switch back to Raven's POV, and their group is about to make the first barter across that lake, where they have to spill a couple drops of their own blood and swim through this lake without being pulled down by these weird siren clone creatures that are trying to kill them, basically. So that's Raven's point of view. And it's worth mentioning, because I will critique this in a second, that throughout the entirety of the book, there is kind of a formula in the way that the character chapters are shown to the reader. So it goes like Raven, Elm, Elspeth, Raven, Elm, Elspeth, Raven, Elm, Elspeth. And it just cycles through these 3 points of view, chapter by chapter by chapter. We don't get substantial sections of each character's POV. We just get one chapter, one chapter, one chapter. And I will discuss how I feel about that, because in the beginning it wasn't so bad, but as the story progressed, I did have a little bit of a problem. So during their first barter, Peter ends up getting mauled by his siren clone thing, and his leg is a mess. It is bleeding this weird, goopy, black, gooey blood, and it's not looking good for Peter. Things are not looking good. So this is where the group learns that the maiden card can actually heal. It's not just about making someone look beautiful and everything like that. It's actually a very substantial and important card in the deck. And it can heal people. It removes all blemishes, but it also genuinely can prevent you from dying. It's pretty cool, actually. And I did like that. I did enjoy learning that information. Like I said, we learned that a chapter or two earlier, where Ione was sharing her experience with the maiden card and everything like that. And Elm had noticed that her hands were cut and that they had magically healed themselves. So this isn't our first introduction to learning that information, but for Raven's group, this is their first introduction to that. So obviously the Nightmare knew that. That's why he told them to bring the maiden card. And Peter's leg gets healed. Everybody's happy. And this is also the moment where the Nightmare finally lets Elspeth leave that weird, shadowy beach in their mind. And he lets her look out through this window in his sight. And so she can see and hear everything that the Nightmare can hear, but she just has absolutely no control over her own body. So we switch back to Castle Stone after Raven and his group go through that first barter. And Elm has come up with a plan to save Ione because the king is still pissed at her. He does want to kill her. He's basically just biding his time. He doesn't want the court to talk about it because obviously with Hoth being in the condition that he's in and them lying about it, if something were to happen to Ione, if the king was to execute her, people would be asking questions. They'd be like, well, what the heck is going on over here? So the king is keeping her on a pretty short leash. And in this time, Elm is trying to come up with a plan to save her life. Because at the same time, the king, making Elm the heir, is asking him to pick a bride. So he's holding all these feasts in Elm's honor and to try to show him basically what his choices are. And Elm is like, no, I'm not going to do that. So he has this brilliant idea to go check out the marriage contract between Hoth and Ione. And we don't get to know exactly what the marriage contract says, but Elm walks away with a nice smile on his face. And so we know that he has devised a plan to save Ione from the fate of death and marrying Hoth. So up until this point in the book, I was genuinely enjoying it. I was able to get past, like I said, the little bit of repetition and that corny moment between Ione and Elm going down to the dungeon. I was like, get over it, Frank, move past it. I felt like Gillig was doing such a good job building tension and making this a more dynamic and interesting story. There's a lot of action going on. The dialogue has greatly improved. And even though it's not perfect, there is a lot of suspense being built up and transpiring within the novel between all of these characters that it did keep me engaged as a reader. I was interested in knowing where this all was going. I will say that the characters all still rang a little flat. They didn't have a lot of dimension. There wasn't much character growth. But considering this was a plot-oriented novel and story, I didn't mind that so much. Because, like I said, there was a lot of action, there was a lot of tension through the actual plot points in the book, that the characters themselves didn't need to be multifaceted per se. So then we flip back to Raven's point of view because, like I said, it flip flops a lot. And they have made their first barter. They have succeeded in swimming through the lake. And as they're trying to get to the next point, the group is ambushed. They are hit with this weird, it's not tear gas, but it's some kind of gas bomb thing that makes them all unconscious. And then after this tense moment where the entire group is knocked out and everything like that, it flips to Elspeth's point of view. And here's where we get more backstory with the Providence cards. We see all of the barters that he's making with the Spirit of the Wood to create these cards. And we do get a bit more context between the Shepherd King and Brutus Owen's relationship. Turns out Brutus Rowan had actually married his sister. They were really good friends. They had grown up together. And Brutus Rowan ended up betraying the Shepherd King, which we do learn that bit later on. So we're getting more backstory. I didn't love this. I did not love the fact that we had this tense moment where the entire group is knocked out with this special gas, and then we flip just to some backstory. It felt like whatever tension had been built up kind of disintegrated very quickly. And I was not a fan of that. I liked learning more about the Shepherd King, but I was not interested. Like, that was not a good moment to introduce us to more backstory. I want to see what's happening in the here and now. So we flip back again at some point to Raven's point of view, and we learn that they have been taken captive by those two sisters I had mentioned, Hessis and Otho, I think is her. I can't remember the girl's name. And it doesn't matter. Hold on, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So they get kidnapped by these people. They wake up, they're all tied up, and they learn that this is kind of like a stronghold for all of the infected people who had run into the forest, into the mist. And this is where they have all congregated. It's this secret little town. And Hessis and Otho were the ones that threw the smoke bomb. They had their own magic, and they force Raven, Jesper, and they had kidnapped Gorse because he had run away. I forgot to mention that. He ran away after the first barter at the lake, but they had kidnapped him. So now all three of them are being forced to fight each other, and Raven ends up killing Gorse. because they needed destrier blood. Everybody in that town was pissed off because they had been run out by destriers or had family members killed by destriers, and so they wanted blood. So Raven ends up killing Gorse. They end up escaping, and then we never see Hessus and Otho again. We hear about them once when Ione is recounting her meeting up with the group later on in the book. But as far as these two characters go, where Gillig made a point to explain their magic, to explain kind of their origin story, to really explore these characters in the short chapter that we get, and then never utilizes them ever again. Weak writing. Why would you introduce these characters and give them absolutely no purpose other than to just be a quick obstacle to the group? It was lazy writing, in my opinion. I feel like Hessus and Otho were such interesting characters, and Gillig could have really, really pushed that envelope and given them a more substantial role in this book, but ultimately decided not to. She brings in these two characters and does absolutely nothing with them. And that actually did annoy me so much. Because it's like, why am I taking the time to learn about these fucking people if I'm never gonna see them again? There could have been this cool moment where at the end of the book, when there's that big fight scene, that they come out of the woods and they're helping the group and they're throwing their smoke bombs and fucking up these destriers. But no. But instead, we never see them ever again. So there's that. I mean, one of the only cool things that we learn is that Elspeth's aunt Opal and her two cousins, Ione's siblings, were there at the stronghold. So we get it confirmed that they are alive, that they are well. So that was cool. But after this moment where Raven's group escapes that stronghold, we flip back to Elm's POV. And in this chapter, he's kind of objectifying Ione. It's been a few times now where he keeps commenting on her ill-fitting garments, and he's annoyed that he can't see her curvy, luscious body because the dresses just don't fit her very well. And I was kind of like, oh, that's not romantic. That's not cute. That's just kind of gross, frankly. Didn't like that so much. Because the first couple times I was like chalking it up to sexual tension between these two characters, but after it kept happening, I was just kind of like, get over it, man. Okay, you can't see her titties. Get over it. This woman has already had everything stripped from her, and all you can think about is the fact that you can't see her hot bod. Weird. It was coming off a little bit misogynistic to me, frankly. And this is kind of the first moment where I started reanalyzing the way that I was interpreting Ione and Elm's dynamic and relationship. Because the thing is, as a reader, we already know there's sexual tension between them. We're already rooting for them. So this addition of just having her wear these ill-fitting garments and have Elm be upset that he can't see her body just felt like a strange layer of sexual objectification that is pretty gross, to be honest with you. And this kind of brings me to my next point, which is that all of this flirting and romance that's happening between Elm and Ione in their respective part of the book it was teetering on becoming gross. There's a specific quote that happens after Elm is thinking about her curves under that ill-fitting dress. And he's thinking to himself, and I'm going to read you the quote because it was frankly gross. And so he says, a pink hue that climbed from beneath the awful frilly collar of her dress into Ione's jaw, settling in her face, making her mouth even pinker. It did wonderful, horrible things to his imagination. He wondered where else she was that shade of pink. Ew! Are you fucking serious? Are you actually joking? Has she not spent any time on the internet where you have these disgusting young men that are literally leaving comments under women's videos that are like, is it pink? I wonder if it's pink. I bet it's pink. Are we serious? And that gave me such a big ick, dude. I was like, somebody punched this motherfucker in the face, right? And it sucks because Elm was one of my favorite characters. And by the end of the book, I still like his character, but this moment was fucking gross. It was nasty. And it did kill a lot of the vibe for me between him and Ione. I was like, okay, I'm really rethinking the way that I feel about these two getting together, because what the fuck? I suppose some people would find this flattering or romantic or sexy, but me personally, dude, I was like, get him the fuck out of here. Somebody remove this man from my face. Get out of my face. And I put the book down. I was like, I'm done for now. I don't want to. No. It was vulgar. It really was. So the taste of their dynamic was beginning to sour for me. And this is where you really got to start thinking about it, because again, as I mentioned, the whole time that Elm actually knows Ione, because they have that moment where they're doing the chalice thing and he's like, oh yeah, I noticed you. I know he noticed her one time running. She was riding a horse and she had mud on her ankles. But they had never spoken before. So he had no idea what kind of person she was actually like. He just had this idea of her. They had never spoken when they were at court together. Never, never, never. So the only version of Ione that he actually knows is the version of her that has absolutely no substance, no personality, no emotion whatsoever. All she has is desire for him. Gillig has condensed Ione's character down to absolutely no personality, super hot, and being completely objectified by Elm the whole time, all while trying to convince us that they have this deep emotional bond and connection with one another, despite the fact that Ione can literally not feel fucking anything, dude, other than desire for him. So that's when I was like, okay, Gillig, I beg of you, get some sensitivity training, how to write female characters, because they all sucked. Oh my God. It pissed me off. I was getting mad. Ugh. And again, Gillig attempts to almost to combat any potential blowback by saying that, oh, well, Elm did notice Ione before she had her entire personality taken away. So obviously he liked her before that. Dude had never spoken to her. So again, he just liked whatever idea of her he had in his mind, not the real her. No, no, no. There is a moment of redemption, almost, not quite, where there is one of the feasts that's happening and the theme is Providence cards. So everybody has to come in and dress as a Providence card. And King Rowan had forced Ione to come dressed as the Nightmare because that was the card that her father had traded in order for her marriage contract to Hoth. Elm is pissed off that his dad has forced her to wear these ugly, ugly dresses that are very ill-fitting, except for the collars that are very tight and almost like an actual collar. And so this does piss Elm off to the point where he does eventually go back to Hawthorne House and bring her back a bunch of her own dresses. That was kind of the only redeeming thing, but then it switches to the next feast and she's wearing this very low cut like V showing her boobs and stuff. And it's like, oh, more objectification. Really cool, really cute, really awesome. Love that. I have to move past this point because I could talk about it forever. It was gross. So this is actually the point also in the book where this back and forth style of narration, where we're going from Elm to Elspeth to Raven to Elm to Elspeth to Raven to Elm, it was annoying because the tension is being built up, right? The relationship and dynamic between Elm and Ione is building up. The tension between Raven and the rest of his group and them getting closer to retrieving the twin alders is building up. And so to go from one chapter that ends on a very tense moment to completely be ripped right out of that and placed in the middle of the other tense moment that you had left off on a couple chapters before. And so you're proceeding with that and the tension is building and then you get ripped out again only to be disorienting. Very disorienting, very sloppy, very annoying to read, because just as you're getting engaged with the characters and their journey and the things that they're experiencing, you get just pulled right out of it. And it kills any emotion that you're feeling. It kills any tension that you're feeling because now you're just being plopped right into the other person's POV and you're like, well, hold on a minute. I want to hear more about what's happening over there, right? And then you're like, okay, fine. You submit to the fact that you're going to have to experience this chapter. So you're reading it and you're like, okay, I'm getting back into it. I kind of remember where we were at. Okay. Oh, no, psych, pulling you right out again. And it pissed me off. The beginning of the book, it wasn't so bad because it was still early enough on in the book to where not a lot of craziness was happening. But the further we got into the book, the more annoying this point got. And I didn't like it. So, just one example of this is we are in one of Elm's chapters, and him and Ione finally find her mating card. And she takes him back up to her room and she's like, "Are you ready to see the real me? Are you ready to experience my actual personality, who I am? Once I release this magic, every emotion, everything that I've experienced that I've been suppressing up until now because of the magic is going to come flooding back. Are you ready for this?" And Elm is like, "Yeah." And what happens? The chapter ends and we're thrust right back into Raven's point of view. And you're annoyed that you just got ripped out of this really important and sincere moment between Ione and Elm. And you're like, okay, fine. So you read Raven's chapter and you're noticing some tension is getting built up in this chapter, right? They've just reached the Alders forest where once they get through it, they'll reach the spirit of the wood. And at this point, Jesper gets infected with the mist. They're running through the forest and they get to the two twin alders trees, the actual trees that are shown on the card, but they're real twin alders. So in this moment, Jesper is dying. There's so much tension happening. Raven is supposed to go barter with the spirit of the wood in this alternate universe. He's supposed to pass through this portal that is going to take him to the spirit of the wood. And everything is really, really tense. And you're super excited. And Raven gets through the portal and he pulls the nightmare and Jesper and everybody. And it's so tense. And then it just cuts out and you switch back to Elm's point of view. And you're like, well, shit. Can I not catch a break? Oh, it was very annoying to me, very irritating. So, in my opinion, this back and forth style of narration was a very poor choice. It was a bad storytelling device. And frankly, it was very disorienting for the reader. Why would you continuously build up all of this tension just to diminish all of it in a moment for the reader? It could have been done so differently. In my opinion, a really easy way to have been able to combat this, because the book is already broken up into 3 parts. So she really could have had part 1 be Elm and Ione storyline, part 2 be Raven and the group storyline, and then part 3 be Elspeth's storyline and getting those flashbacks of the Shepherd King and the origin of the Providence cards and all of this up, while simultaneously wrapping up where Elm and Raven's stories kind of converge. And that would have been perfect, in my opinion. But hey, I'm sure Gillig had a reason for doing something so stupid and poorly done. I just don't know what it is. And then this leads me to one of my other critiques, which is that, again, as I mentioned, all of Elspeth's POV chapters are basically just the Shepherd King's chapters. And to make a main character be completely overshadowed by every other character in the book, she did this in the first book as well, but it's much more prominent in the second book. I feel like, especially because Elspeth's is the only one that's first person point of view. So clearly her perspective is very important, but it's actually not, because she is a nothing ass nobody fucking character in the book. Again. So to me, this signifies a lack of ability to write strong, multi-dimensional female characters. Again, the whole introduction of Hessus and Otho and not utilizing them at all, not giving them any kind of substantial part in the book, taking Elspeth, who is theoretically the main character, and making her a nothing person, taking Ione's character, who arguably is one of the better written female characters, and still having her have no personality, no discerning characteristic outside of the fact that in the majority of the book, she has no personality, she has no emotion outside of just wanting to fuck Elm. That's the most prominent emotion that she has, is desire, lust. I mean, excuse the fuck out of me, but that doesn't give strong female main character. That gives, you need to take a fucking sensitivity class and course on how to write women. Because if I didn't know that Rachel Gillig was a woman, I would have assumed that a man had written this. It was so poorly anti-fucking feminist. It was disturbing, to be honest with you. Now, one of my last criticisms that I have for part 2 before I reach my conclusion and everything is that the lore for this story was kind of confusing. Specifically, in one of Raven's parts towards the end of the book, where we are talking about the mist and the infection and why it exists, the way that it's phrased is making it seem like the reason that the spirit of the wood created the mist was to lure infected people back into the alders wood and feed the twin alders trees that because they're sentient and they feed off of infected people. So it almost felt like the mist, it was created simply to lure people to feed the trees, and the trees being fed feeds the mist. And that was kind of confusing. I didn't really get it. It was like, okay, so the whole point of this infection is actually just to feed these twin alders trees so that they could feed the mist, so that the mist can feed the twin alders, so that okay, I guess. Didn't get it, didn't care. I was at the end, I was like, I don't give a shit. It was just confusing. So part 2 ends with one of Elm's chapters, and we are returned to the moment where Ione relinquishes the Power of the Maiden card, and all her emotions come flooding back. And her and Elm embark on this new phase of their relationship where Ione actually does have a personality. And to be honest, I was into it. It was a bit redeemable from where we had left off, the feelings that I was having about Elm objectifying Ione. I was like, okay, she finally has a real personality now. So at least this feels a bit more substantial. They're riding full speed on horseback and they're both feeling free and happy and all this stuff. And they have this sexy moment in the woods. And there was a moment that I actually did laugh out loud because of how ridiculous it was, where they're riding full speed on horseback side by side and they are able to lean over and kiss each other. And Gillig makes a point to talk about how difficult it is and how basically unrealistic it is. And then she's like, but they did it anyway. And it's like, oh my God, have you ever ridden a horse, dude? You're telling me you guys are riding full speed on horseback and you're leaning in to kiss each other? No way. Absolutely the fuck not. Ridiculous. Especially because it just, after that, they get off their horse and they have this little sexy moment. And it's like, what was the point of this kiss riding full speed on horseback? Why would you mention how unrealistic it is? And then you're just like, yeah, but we did it anyway. And it's like, oh, so you just went against the laws of physics to do this? Okay, yeah. Sure, buddy. Whatever you say, man. Fuck off. So they get freaky by some trees, right? And there's this really corny, unsettling moment between Ione and Elm that's supposed to be hot and sexy, but for me, I was like, I'm gonna barf in my mouth. Where she basically is like, she pulls his pants down and she doesn't say it in so many words, but it's alluded to where she's like, oh my God, Elm. And basically it's like, damn, your dick is so big. And he goes, oh my God. He basically is like, no, don't say that or else I'm going to come too fast. Is that supposed to be hot? It's disgusting. Gross. Listen, don't even get me wrong. Okay. Like, I get what it was supposed to be doing, but holy crap, was that corny and really, it was icky. It was icky, nasty, gross. But hey, the rest of the scene was okay. It was spicy. It was fine. And of course, after their romp in the woods, they get back to Castle Stone and they're going to Elm's room. And wouldn't you know, Hoth is sitting there, fully healed, fully beautiful, just waiting for them. And that's where part 2 ends. Now, I'm not going to lie, at this point, I was like, the tension was there for me, absolutely. And I found myself wishing that Elm had just fucking killed his brother earlier in the book. But you know, every book needs a villain, every book needs a bad guy. And Hoth is the bad guy in this book. So obviously, you can't kill him off too soon. So part 3 opens up to a very short chapter of Elspeth and obviously everybody in the domain, in the realm of the spirit of the wood, because like I said, Raven had pulled them all through that portal. So this is a very short chapter. Nothing really happens outside of us discovering that they have all made it into the Spirit of the Woods territory. And then immediately after Elspeth's chapter, we switch right back to Elm, where we actually care because there's a lot of tension happening there. And in this chapter, Hoth and Lyndon pull some fuck shit. They stab Ione in the heart to see if the maiden card can save someone from death. And it's just a really tense, evil moment in the book where you're just mad that this is how events are transpiring. You're feeling sadness for Elm because he's, again, being tortured by his brother. He's watching this woman that he loves be stabbed to death right in front of him and not being able to do anything. So that feeling of powerlessness and all that he used to feel when his brother used to torture him, and also just the reality of the situation that he is in fact powerless, right? In this moment, he is totally powerless. And the tension is there. I'm not even gonna lie. I wanted to know what was going on. Everything else, I was ignoring all the gross, icky stuff, but how I felt between Ione and Elm, and I was just wanting them. I wanted it to work out. I'm a romantic at heart. So that was really tense. And I do feel like Gillig, this was a very strong point in her writing where that tension is there. Things are coming to a close. Like I said, we're in the third part of the book now. So things are vamping up. And there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of despair in this chapter. Hoth, who was already a cruel and indifferent human being, is now using the maiden card, which makes him even more cruel and more indifferent and emotionless. So naturally, they just stabbed Ione. There's blood all over the place. Elm's crying over her. And the king comes in and he sees all this blood, sees Elm on the floor, doesn't give a flying fuck, and just beelines it straight to Hoth. And it's like, oh my God, you're all right. I'm so happy. You're okay. And you're like, you're such a dick, dude. You're such a bad father. You're a bad person. You're not vibing with the king at all. And this moment is so tense. There's so much pressure. There's so much raw emotion happening. And what is the natural progression for Gillig to do in this moment? Completely cut it with a fucking knife and just switch right back to Raven's POV. Dilute everything that you were just feeling, rip you right out of it, and place you back into a POV that you just, frankly, at this point, I wasn't concerned about. Yeah, it was getting to be too much. I was starting to get really dizzy with this back and forth bullshit. So Raven, I have to speed this up because this video is getting so long again and I'm tired of editing long videos. So Raven gets the card. He learns that he is actually a descendant of the Shepherd King. The Shepherd King's son, Bennett, had the ability to rip up cards and destroy them. And that's why there were only 3 scythes, even though 4 were made. And he managed to get away from Brutus Rowan and start a family. And he changed their name from Taxus to you. And so we learn all this by the Spirit of the Wood. Raven gets the Twin Alders. They make a beeline because they come back out in through this portal, and wouldn't you know it, months have passed and all of a sudden it's solstice, right? When they went into the realm, it was like 2 or 3 months before solstice, and now, or a month, because, excuse me, they were gone for 24 days. So they were in this realm for a month, but to them it felt like a few minutes. And I'm going to get past all of the confusing lore because, again, I don't care. I just accepted it at face value. But I did find it kind of confusing how that all went down, like why Brutus Rowan didn't just kill Bennett. There was a moment where we get the flashback. We get to see how it all transpired. But I still was kind of lost about how a fully grown, well-trained man couldn't just use a sword or something to kill this kid. Anyway. Whatever, right? Whatever. So we switch back to Elm's POV, and the king has thrown a feast in Hoth's honor. They're all dancing. They're up on the dais. Hoth is using his scythe card against Elm and Ione so that they can't really move. They can't really do anything. And Hoth kind of nods to Lyndon, and he's like, give Elm that flagon of wine so that he can pour it into my dad's cup. So Elm is forced to pour this wine. The king ends up choking and dying because it was poisoned. Who would have guessed? Who would have guessed that Hoth, the evil psycho son of a bitch who now has absolutely no emotion, no feelings whatsoever, was gonna pull some fuck shit like that. So he blames it on Elm and is like, Elm's the one that did it. We all just saw it. We all witnessed it. He was the one that poured the poison. He killed the king. And everybody in the hall is like, what the hell? So right before the king officially dies, he just gives Elm his scythe card, and Elm is able to escape with Ione. And they get on a horse and they're riding, and he's using this scythe card to hold everybody in place, to freeze everyone in the hall in place so that they can't run after him. And this was all going great. The tension was being built up in the scene right up until Ione and Elm escape. And wouldn't you know it, Elm falls right off the horse. And Ione gets down and she's like, come on, we gotta go, we gotta go. And he's like, no, go on without me. Why? I'm confused. Why could it? And again, plot armor. There was no real reason. There was no tangible reason. Gillig then addresses this later on during their reunion when they finally do get together. And he's like, oh, I should have gone with you. Yeah, you really should have, because you spent a month being tortured in the dungeon for no fucking reason, dude. No reason. He wanted to play the martyr for no, he really could have gotten back up. He was in a lot of pain because he was using the scythe card, right? I understand that. But he really, really, really could have just, like, why not switch it and have Ione be the one to use the scythe? She had another scythe. There were two. Switch back and forth. Get on the horse, switch back and forth, and go. And then anyway, again, plot armor, really annoying. I did not like that at all, dude. Not even a little bit. I couldn't for the life of me figure out why he couldn't just go with her. And again, during the wrap up, we learned that he very well could have gone with her and he just made a stupid choice. Okay, sure. So here's where we are approaching the climax of the story. And we obviously, for that month that Raven and his group were in the Spirit of the Woods dimension, this was the month that Elm had gotten captured and he spent being tortured in the dungeon alongside Eric Spindle and Tieran Hawthorne. And of course, okay, right? Just gonna have to let it go. I just had to accept the fact that that's just the way events were transpiring. And Hoth was planning on trading Elm in exchange for the Twin Alders card. When Raven got back, that was what he was gonna do. He was never actually planning on keeping Elm alive. He was just gonna kill everybody, but he was gonna present it as a trade with Raven. And of course, Raven and his group get out. They realize that it's solstice. And they run full speed through the Alderswood, through the lake, through the everything in one day. When they get out, it is the morning of solstice. They have until midnight to end the mist or whatever, to unite the deck, or else they have to wait until the next solstice, which I feel like Gillig touched on why in the first book, but for the life of me, I could not remember. So again, just another thing I accepted at face value. I was like, fine, fuck it. So here's where I was a bit confused. This was something that was I did not understand the timeline of events at all, because from my perspective, this whole book building up where Raven and his group are exchanging these barters and going through all this stuff to get to the Twin Alders trees and make the barter with the Spirit of the Wood. It felt like it was a few days at least. They had camped out at least 2 or 3 nights. So it took them a few days to get through all of this story to get to the Twin Alders trees. But they were able to make it back to Castle U in less than a day. I mean, to be fair, they were running full speed and they did not stop to take a breath or anything like that. But still, it felt like it was badly done. It felt like it was just trying to rush things along. It felt like it, oh, who gives a shit that it took them multiple days to trek across all this forest and the lake and all this crap. We're just going to have them speed run it. Speed run it. They got less than 24 hours. Again, I was not having a lot. By this point in the book, I was just reading it to finish it. I was like, let's wrap it up. Let's get through this because I want to be done with this fucking duology. So whatever. So they do make it back to Castle U. They have the whole fight scene. Hoth ends up stabbing Raven in the gut. They trick Hoth into getting into the chamber with the one dark window. Elm and Ione are actually, they rip off Hoth's braid of horsehair around his wrist. So now he has no charm and gets infected with the mist. And they use his blood to unite the deck. And his ending was kind of abrupt. Hoth's ending, after doing all this terrible, evil shit, after the fact that he is still using the maiden's magic that is supposedly able to heal him of anything aside from the infection, his body literally just gets carried off into the mist as it recedes. That's Hoth's ending. Pretty anticlimactic, in my opinion. It wasn't enough retribution for me personally, but okay, I'm glad that nobody else had to die. So that was okay. So then, of course, with the deck being united, one last card remains. It's all 12 cards kind of like condensed down to the one card called the Shepherd, and the Shepherd can heal anybody of an infection. All they have to do is tap it 3 times and their infection is cured. And it ends with Jesper using her magic, because remember, she got infected when they went into the Alderswood. So her magic was actually the same as Tilly's, which was the Shepherd King's daughter, where she could heal people with her touch. So she ends up healing Raven. Everybody lives happily ever after, aside from Hoth, obviously. And so Raven wakes up, and lo and behold, Elma's gonna be king. Jesper and Emery are healed of their infection. Everybody's happy. And, okay, that's a pretty standard ending. I didn't mind. I was actually pleasantly surprised with the ending, if I'm being honest with you. I was happy. I'm a sucker for a happily ever after, okay? So the mist has receded. They're able to reunite with the other kingdoms, resume trade routes and all the stuff that they haven't been able to do for the last 500 years. And something that I did add, and it was such a killer because this was the last sentence. We get to the epilogue, right? And in the epilogue, everybody's cured of their infection that wants to be. Ione and Elm are getting married in the epilogue, and everybody's happy, and it's a really cute moment. And we learn that Raven didn't want to heal himself of his infection, and that Elspeth was unable to actually heal herself because if she were to touch the Shepherd card, she would actually absorb its power and nobody else would be able to use it. So the way that they got rid of the Shepherd King at the end before the epilogue was that Raven, having the same power as Bennett, his ancestor, aka the Shepherd King's son, was able to rip up the cards and render them useless. So he ripped up the last nightmare card and the Shepherd King's soul disappeared and crossed the veil. Very heart-wrenching moment, very sad. I didn't cry or anything like that. It wasn't that emotionally impactful for me, but it was a sad moment and it was a good part of the wrap-up. But then we're immediately thrown into the epilogue where Ione and Elm are getting married. And I was with it. I was with the shit. I was okay with how this was all wrapping up. Right up until the last sentence, where Elspeth says something along the lines of how she was actually the author of everything, right? How throughout the entire book, her and the Shepherd King were shepherding everybody else to their destiny, to fulfill their fates and their obligations and their storylines and everything like that. And Elspeth was like, and I was more akin to being the author, as though she was the one that wrote out the stories. And it's like, no, you fucking weren't. You didn't do shit. You literally did nothing. You were a nothing character. You were not all, and it made me mad because all that Elspeth really was merely a physical vessel for the actual main character of the story, which was the Nightmare / Shepherd King. And it made me upset that she was phrased and shown as the main protagonist or as this really important character when at the end of the day, she actually wasn't. She was merely a vessel for the story. And I didn't like that. It rang very hollow and it tried to give her an air of importance that she merely did not have in the story. And I'm actually sad that she didn't have it in the story because, like I've mentioned a few times, I did not like her character. And it's not for lack of trying. I really, really, really did want to like her character. I really wanted to care about her in that way, but I just couldn't because Gillig never gave us that opportunity. She merely made Elspeth a vessel for the Shepherd King and to move his story forward, to progress his story, for him to get his revenge, for us to learn his history. Elspeth had no personality, and she was most definitely not the author of these other characters' fates. She wasn't even the one shepherding any of them. It was the Shepherd King doing that. So to give that literally the very last sentence of the book to say, and I was their author, no, the fuck you were not. No, the flip you were not. Absolutely not. And it left such a bitter taste in my mouth. I was perfectly ready and willing to accept the ending with the nightmare disappearing and crossing the veil to the epilogue with Ione and Elm being the first of their name, the king of elms and whatever, and getting married and all this stuff. I was perfectly ready and willing to accept that. And then to leave me with such a nasty taste in my mouth, phrasing Elspeth to be like the shepherd of the story. No, absolutely not. So that made me sad because I was vibing with the ending right up until that point, and it just felt really disingenuous, to be honest with you. Now, much like the first book, I did feel like the ending was strong. Did I feel like it was strong enough to hold up the rest of the book in the ways that I felt like it failed? I can't say. For me personally, not so much. For the amount of hype that this duology gets, I was gravely disappointed. Would I recommend this book to this duology to anybody else? Maybe. Like if they were looking for just a quick read, something to like not care about, not really invest themselves in, maybe I would recommend it. But if you are looking for, fully fleshed out characters and a book that makes sense and a book that doesn't objectify its female main characters, I would not recommend this. But that's just my opinion. Like I said, a lot of people loved this duology, and I'm so glad that people can enjoy books that I don't enjoy. Not every book is for every reader, and I just think that this duology was not for me. Does that mean I don't think that there's value in it or that other people can't find value in it? No, of course not. Everybody there, like I said, this has a 4 point something rating on Goodreads. So out of the hundreds of thousands of people that rated this, I would say that overall it left a positive impression for most people. For me personally, I did not like it. I did not like it. But hell, man. I mean, you tell me. What did you think? Did you enjoy this duology? Did you feel similarly or dissimilarly in regard to the characters and how they were written? I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know, guys. Until next time.